this focus will be on the state of plan giving, and a lot of credit goes to the other folks at FreeWill for tons and tons of research. There's a 25, 26-page report that many of you have already downloaded that really dives into an enormous amount of research. So really glad to share this with you now. We'll break down some of the key takeaways and talk about what to do about those. And if you want to go spend some light reading with the report, feel free to do that as well. Quick note, as usual, we were able to get the CFRE approved for 1 credit. So we know a lot of you have zeroed out professional development budgets. So we work on this every week and usually in advance. So there's a question in the survey just to certify your participation, but hopefully this is really helpful in getting you the hours that you need. Today's agenda, introductions. We'll share some of our insights for plan giving in 2020, and then we'll share some strategies for growing plan gifts. So this will be very, very plan giving focused. We'll share some ideas from the community, and then we'll talk about next steps and do Q&A as well. Many of you know me, but my name is Patrick. I am delighted to be the co-founder and co-CEO alongside my co-founder Jenny of a great company called FreeWill. And we're really excited, as usual, to be alongside about 70 people now, mostly in New York, although scattered to the winds during COVID. And we just spend all our time thinking about what the future of planned giving and major giving is, and how do we make it better for donors and better for nonprofits at the same time. So really wonderful group, and I know some of them are listening today. So hello to you guys around New York and around the rest of the country. We asked you how your week was doing and how it was going. And in the survey, a couple of interesting trends. One is that happiness is coming back, and my hope is that the long weekend really provided some respite. I know that a lot of folks are dealing with increased stress in the last 10 days through fires and other things. Loneliness continues to trend down. I hope that you're able to build community in this new moment. And then anxiety has taken a really big drop, which I would not have expected given the news events of the last 10 days. So that's really good to see. So fewer than about a third of people are feeling anxious right now. And then as usual, we ask you what you're worried about. There's actually been a rise over the past month in people worried about hitting goals, but over the last 2 or 3 weeks, that's dropped pretty considerably. My hope is that this means people are really able to find some action steps and making lemonade out of lemons. As we navigate this new world, actually a lot of new strategies present themselves that weren't available before that. The one sort of orange tick that you can see halfway up that's ticked up is around doing my job well. So I would imagine that as we're heading into end of year giving, that there's some things that are tricky. And as we head into colder weather where you can't even be outside for a lot of places, that there are some challenges here. So hopefully we can help you with the doing your job well as hitting your goals. Okay, so let's dive into the research here. So the background before we get into this is that we looked at more than 80,000 estate plans across the FreeWill platform. And we looked at that compared to previous years. We looked at that with gender, economic status, marital status, children's status, all these things to really understand who is giving, how are they giving, how much are they giving, and then what should we do about it. So that's been a ton of back-end research on our side, and now these are some of the results. So just to give everybody a little bit of context for where we are. First really interesting thing, people give fewer bequests, but more money as they age. So what that looks like is that middle-aged adults, the sort of 45 to 64 cohort, make up about 35% of the adult population, but give nearly half of all bequest dollars. This is really interesting. Young adults, 18 to 24, they make very few wills. And so this isn't going to be a big part of your plan giving strategy, but 22% of them include bequests in their wills, almost double those over 65. So a couple of notes here. One is that actually as we get younger, and not just in terms of sort of people post childbearing age, but you have lower number of children per family or per woman, which is how it's often calculated in demographics, as the generations slip. And so if you think about 45 to 64, you actually have many more people who don't have children and will choose not to have children ever in that cohort than in the above 64. Now, 18 to 24, many of those will have children in the future. That may change, but really interesting to see that giving rate. And as you watch that sort of giving rate go up by younger ages, it is a really, really promising sign for plan giving for the next few decades. Here's what that looks like. And we'll sort of just spend a moment letting you all look at the data. So 18 to 24, 22% of wills have bequests, but the value of those bequests is not that high. As you can imagine, 18 to 24-year-olds do not have a lot of assets. From 25 to 24, there's a significant drop off. Some of these people have minor children, which is going to be a hard driver down, and the value is 17%. And then you go to 45 to 64, there's a lot of wealth in that segment and a lot of willingness to give. And the same is true at 65 plus. So some really interesting data looking at how generations are changing and how those folks interact a little bit differently. Insight 2. So historically, people have talked about focusing plan giving on women, but there's some really interesting data here. So men are less likely to make bequests, but they give more bequest dollars. Nearly 60%, so 3 out of every 5 gifts comes from women, but more than 54% of the total bequest value comes from men. Male will makers or male estate planners are slightly less likely to include bequests in their wills than women, about 12% to about 13.3. So what this means is you have less estate planning coming from men. In that, sort of on average, those men are less generous, but the gifts that they do give are significantly larger. Some of this is if you look at income from the 60s and 70s, and those folks who are getting older now, obviously male income in the 60s and 70s was considerably higher, through the 80s, continuing to the wealth gap now. You also sort of end up with more of these like big statement gifts that are almost, flexes of manhood, for lack of a better term, from men. And so some of the largest gifts will be from men, even if the frequency of gifts will be from women. Here's what the breakdown looks like from the data. So you can see a pretty sharp divide in the percentage of wills made from women who are the sort of ocean blue in this context and men who are in orange. And then you see the number of bequests made. So 3 out of every 5 gifts are from women, but then the value of bequests is significant, pretty shifted, so 55 to 45. Now, why does this matter and why does this insight matter? Well, a lot of organizations only count bequest expectancies in terms of numbers, right? And so because you don't have access to the data of how big that gift is, you might think, wow, 60% of these gifts are coming from women. Let's make sure to focus only on women because the pure quantity of gifts is much higher. But the additional insight that we can layer on here is that most organizations don't know the amount that that gift is going to be, and that men tend to give a bit more. And so you actually want to have this balanced approach for gender, which runs a little bit contrary to some of the customary best practices in plan giving. So really interesting how more data can inform behavior and actually shift one of these sort of common tropes that we have in plan giving. All right. Insight number 3, people with fewer family attachments are much more likely to make bequests. And this is sort of obvious and relatively standard, but those without children are twice as likely to make bequests in their wills. In fact, I saw somewhere that there's data that for folks who don't have spouses and don't have children, almost 50% of those estate plans include a charitable gift. These people are also giving much more generously, so they make more than 63% of total bequest value, despite writing only 23% of wills. So they're almost 3 times as valuable, twice as many gifts, and then 50% higher giving. So if you know that folks don't have children, these are your top prospects. Individuals who are single are also, as you might guess, more likely to make bequests than they're married, and that's by nearly 8 percentage points. So single people better than married people, at least in this context, no value judgments overall. And then folks without children, much more likely to be giving than people with children. And those two combine. So a single person with children will be less likely than a single person without children. Married people without children will be more likely to give than married folks with. All right, here's a really interesting insight that we didn't expect, but we were able to learn a little bit last year and is really, really insightful. And what it means is that a lot of animal organizations in particular tend to be a bit smaller. And so they are less likely to take on plan giving because they're just feeling a little bit constrained from a development team and an overall resourcing standpoint. But the animal organizations that do take on plan giving just crush it. And some of the most incredibly successful organizations on FreeWill are these animal groups who are saying, look, we're small. Normally an organization of our size wouldn't invest here, but what we see is that those folks are wildly successful. So pet owners, which we're counting here as people that note in their estate plan so they have a pet. So there may be some folks who haven't noted it but do have a pet, and we don't have that data. they're 55% more likely to make bequests. I mean, this is wild. This is almost as big an impact of having kids or not having kids. So pet owners, counterintuitively, are incredibly important. Except that folks, that will makers without pets are making larger gifts. So why is this true? It may be that there's some income there where you have fewer upper class families with pets. We don't actually know that, but there's some, if you have some hypotheses, note that in the chat around why there might be so much more giving from pet owners, but actually slightly lower gifts. So feel free to add your own hypothesis there. I'd be really curious to know what you guys think. Here's what the stats look like. So you can see that only 25% of people have pets, but that accounts for 35% of all bequests made and 31% of the value of bequests, and that their giving rate, meaning how many people are including any gift at all, is significantly higher. So really interesting stuff. We're seeing some cool hypotheses in the chat that compassion through daily pet therapy, maybe it helps take you out of your own self a little bit and think more about others because you're taking care of this creature all the time. Also, pets are expensive, and so that may shift. You need to have at least some disposable income in order to have a pet. And then Kathy from Think Giving, who's one of my favorite people in the plan giving world and one of the smartest, certainly in the space, says pet owners are loving, compassionate, and they probably support multiple charities much more than the average norm. So really, really interesting. Hello, Kathy. All right, insight 5, estate planning and bequests have surged during the coronavirus pandemic. And those of us that have joined us have seen this, but let's look a little bit more at the data. So in several of the last 7 months, we've seen a more than 100% increase in wills with bequests in 5 out of those months compared to 2019. So this is pretty dramatic. Some of this, and I'll acknowledge this, has been work on our team as we run experiments to improve giving rates. So some of that has a little bit of color, but it doesn't account for the massive upswing. Cassie asked, is this data coming from FreeWill or all bequests in general? This data is coming from our analysis of estate plans made through the site. So great question. March in particular saw a 450% increase in wills with bequests and 163% increase in total wills made. So really, really striking. So this is what the graph looks like of estate plans on our site. You can see a couple big spikes. Usually the first 2 big spikes are one, that July, October, which is a little bit more of 2018. That was when we were on the front page of the New York Times. And so you can see a shift there. And then that April of 2019 is when the AARP wrote a really lovely piece about FreeWill and mailed it out to 37 million seniors. And so what you can see is this big spike in March is higher than when the AARP mailed 32 million people a story about making estate plans. And you can see this sort of big jump to the right that's continued on. And so September is another big promising month. August was off the charts as well. Really just see a massive surge here as well. All right, so let's share a couple more insights about estate planning in 2020. Some of this data, by the way, predates COVID. So this is from a caring.com survey that ran in February and March, but it's an important context for all of the work that we're doing overall. So we still have an estate planning crisis in America. And the percentage of respondents who have an estate planning document in this survey that caring.com ran along with Gallup, which is a pretty well-known survey company and does really strong methodology, is you see that even in 2017, only low 40s percentage of Americans had an estate plan, and that number drops off all the way down to 32%. So really, really interesting. If you look at this drop off is at every age, but it's actually most pronounced in the 55 plus crowd. So really striking, fewer than 50% of people over 55 have an estate plan, which is pretty remarkable and not very good. What you can see is also that this does vary by income level, but even at the $80,000 a year plus level, fewer than 45% of people have an estate planning document. And so it is, some people, certainly there's an area of people thinking, I don't have enough assets to make an estate plan, but there's also a lot of people who just feel nervous about starting the process. And so you see that as one of the biggest hesitations. What is the main reason when we ask people why they don't have a will or a living trust or some of these other estate planning documents? What you can see is people not getting around to it is by far the leading figure. And so this feeling of I will do it someday but not today is pretty dominant. And then people often say they don't have enough assets to leave anyone. And what you see is that this actually, this data outstrips the people that, if you look at economic analysis, actually don't have that many assets. And so people tend to underestimate their own assets, things like retirement accounts, the value of their home, et cetera. So really, really important. And then some people find it too expensive or don't know how to get started. But this contrast is, how important is it for you to have a will or a living trust? And at least in 2019, almost 78% of people said very important, and about 60% said very important in 2020. So people feel it's important, but still haven't done it. All right, so let's make a little bit of sense of all this data and what to do about it. And feel free again to pop questions in the Q&A as it comes in. So the first thing is that one of the biggest hurdles that you'll face as a plan giving professional, or if you're someone who's generating plan gifts for your organization, is that this barrier of people not wanting to make estate plans at all is a precursor, obviously, to them making plan giving at all. Making plan gifts, excuse me. So 70% of Americans don't have an up-to-date will. Even in the figures that we showed, many of those estate plans will be 8, 10, 20 years out of date. And maybe there's a new grandchild, maybe there's a new child, maybe they moved states, maybe there's a new house or a new car. And so actually the percentage of people with an estate plan dramatically overestimates the number of people with an up-to-date estate plan, which is pretty key. Some people assume it's difficult or expensive. Many people don't think they need one. There's this problem that we have when we talk about estate planning, that people think an estate is like a castle in Ireland, and that they don't have an estate and therefore it's not something they need, as opposed to, do you have stuff? And would you like someone to take care of your funeral, et cetera. They also don't know everything they can do. So let's say that you have children, but you don't feel like you have stuff. You still need an estate plan to nominate guardians, to provide for pets, et cetera. And once people get more context as to why to make an estate plan, they're more likely to make one. And then once they make one, they're much more likely to give. So really key points here. One thing we often hear from, especially plan giving professionals, is that, oh no, my donors all have estate plans and they really know what they're doing. And that can be a risk of what's called availability bias, which is I take information from what's available to me without recognizing all the things that I don't see. So the donors who contact you, especially if you're a plan giving professional, or if you have things like estate planning panels or other information sessions, those are the people who are the most savvy on estate planning and can risk giving you a false picture of overall preparedness. When we did some of our early research at Stanford around estate planning, we would talk to literal rocket scientists who still didn't have an estate plan. And so this idea that our donors are too sophisticated to not have an estate plan, they're too wealthy, et cetera, ends up actually not being true for most people. It's just that the people you speak with are the savviest 1, 2, 3% of the group. So keep an eye on that. We all, including me, make mistakes based on availability bias all the time. The other thing is providing easy ways for donors to make their wills or their estate plans and leave a bequest to your organization. One of the biggest challenges we see in estate planning is that almost 9 out of 10 times that someone makes an estate plan, they're not asked about charitable giving. And there's so much happening in estate planning, right? Who gets your pets? Who gets a stamp collection? Who's watching out for the kids? What songs you want at your funeral? That charitable giving is not priority 1. It's also not priority 4 or 5 for most people. And so as a nonprofit sector, we need to be pushing estate planning so that we are front and center in that process, as opposed to being an afterthought. Because what we find is that a lot of legal services online, things like LegalZoom, but also a lot of attorneys don't ask about charitable giving during the process. And there's some research that shows giving drops by almost 85%, 80-ish% when you don't ask about charitable giving, right? Because most of your donors have this habit of annual giving, but they're only doing their estate planning once or twice. And so they don't build the habit and muscle memory of making these gifts. So this is really key. Yes, you can use online tools like FreeWill, and we obviously support that, but you can also walk donors through the will-making process. That may be a wills guide or just a couple of articles on your website around why this is so important. One of the things that is the biggest difference in the philanthropic sector between England and the US is that while England lags behind most of the United States in different types of philanthropy, they are far, far ahead on plan giving. And it's because organizations take such an active role in promoting estate planning, which is a very big shift from our world across the pond. You also want to educate the donors on the why of the estate planning before just telling them to do it, both for them and for your organization. So for many people, this might be the most important gift they ever make, but it's also really critical for pets, for family, for funeral arrangements, all these things. So really important stuff here, and I hope it's useful as well. So when you think about donor education, here's sort of a rough checklist. Are you providing reasons to make a will or an estate plan? Is it clear that this is how to support your organization in a way that doesn't affect your donor financially today? So as we look at a bifurcated economy where some people are doing very well and some people are really struggling, this is an avenue to stay involved in a way that may not be true for folks who can't make a large cash gift at the moment. For wealthier donors, obviously reducing estate taxes for heirs, you might want to take a look and make sure that you know, if you're a national organization, the states that have lower income tax thresholds. So a place like Rhode Island has an income tax starting at $500,000, even while the national federal income tax level is about 10.5 million. So if you can pick out a couple of those key states and you have a large donor base, well, let's go talk to the couples in Rhode Island about estate planning and how to shield some of that from taxes. Okay, question or sort of tactic 2 here is really focus on your key donor segments. So spend the most time and energy on those donors who are most likely to give and those who give larger amounts. So those with fewer family attachments, pet owners, middle-aged donors and older donors, and those with fewer family attachments are key. The gifts end up being much larger. And many of these donors are making wills, which makes the opportunity to capture gifts much higher. Before we go any further, actually, I want to note, because a lot of people might think, well, how do I know who has kids and who doesn't? And you can't just go call somebody and say, hey, do you have kids? And it can be a little bit rude based on their experience of, some people actively choose not to have children. Some people would like to have children, aren't able to for a wide variety of reasons. So it can be a little bit insensitive. One way that organizations do this is using surveys that will say something like, what's important to you about this organization? A couple other questions. Do you share, how important is it for you to share these values of the organization with your children? 1, super important. 2, moderately, et cetera. NA, I don't have kids. And so that is a sort of much gentler way to surface who has children, who doesn't. That isn't sort of in your face, tell us about your kids, which can be challenging for some people. And so sensitive, thoughtful, also super useful, because then those people can become very strong plan giving prospects. So here's another thought. You don't want to forget about younger donors, which can be counterintuitive as well. Obviously, the life expectancy of someone who's 30 is significantly greater than someone who's already 84. They're more likely to include bequests, even if in smaller amounts. These donors can also be stewarded for other types of giving. So someone who joins your legacy society because they are at 35 or at 40 isn't going to shut off other giving. It's a chance for you to bring them much closer to the organization, and you'll be getting a lot more gifts as well. By the way, Renee mentions she's actually calling in from the UK, so good evening to you over there. And she's in the UK now, and bequest ads are frequent on TV. Now, this almost never exists in the US, but because plan giving is such a powerful way of giving, and it's so common, that the television and subway ads that you see for bequests are off the charts in the UK compared to the US, where we actually tend to underinvest in this. So really key difference. And I hope that that's actually in some future segment, we can get some of the experts from Britain over here and share some of the learnings that they've had. Back to younger donors, the research from Russell James shows that after a donor includes a charity in their will, they increase annual giving by more than 3x. So this is super important because you get folks who are now going to be loyal donors for 50 years or 40 years on top of a large gift at the end. So historically, we thought of this funnel as annual gift, monthly gift, major gift, planned gift. But in some cases, you can actually get people in with a planned gift and then continue to steward them for other gifts as well. So it's sort of an inverted donor pyramid that can be really, really powerful. For younger donors, and younger donors might have the reaction of, well, I plan to live for 70, 80 more years. You can talk about how these gifts don't affect them financially today and the chance to be part of a legacy society. So a lot of your organizations will have different circles for major donors, other key benefactors, and then a society for legacy givers. And for most young people, those clubs and cohorts are inaccessible. You don't have the money to write a $50,000 check. But the chance to be part of a legacy society helps you interact with the organization and feel sort of higher status within the organization in a really important way. Now, the other thing that's really interesting here is that if you are an older donor and you're stewarding older donors, the idea that people who are not also 85 are part of the legacy society is really energizing. And it's exciting, and it's a way for those donors to see that this organization is going to have a bright future, and it makes it more likely that those donors continue to give and to include you in their estate plans long term. So the more that we can highlight the prevalence of young people making planned gifts, it has obviously a benefit on young people. It also has this benefit on old people. So another thing that's a little counterintuitive, but really, really important as a way to steward effectively. And then animal-focused orgs, we talked about this a little bit. The way that you can really, really be effective as an animal organization is say, this is a resource, make sure you do your estate planning as a way to take care of your pets. And there's this sort of framing that you'll see that says, this adorable picture of a puppy that says, what happens to me if something happens to you? And that frame of let's make sure the pets are looked after is really powerful. It drives a ton of estate planning, which then drives a ton of giving. And so you see this these remarkable results for animal organizations, some of which are only $700,000, $800,000 a year in annual revenue and are generating $3 or $4 million a year in bequest commitments right now. So really cool for animal organizations. And as other organizations think about, what is it that estate planning can add value to the donor outside of charitable giving? So really key if you can provide that sort of element. So just as an example, if you are a religious institution, you might ask, what are the songs, what are the hymns you want to, at your funeral, make sure to include that as part of an estate plan. And then also if you want to leave a gift to the church or the synagogue, that would be really welcome. So just thinking about what are the additional ways that we can add value and add sort of customization for these type of donors is really key. Bill asks, by the way, do people ask for a copy of a will to get into the Legacy Society? Our suggestion would be definitely not. And the reason for that is it's very rare that people defraud their way into a legacy society. That's just not how humans operate. And even if that happens once or twice at a very large organization, the benefit of making it easy for people to join who have made you in their will but may not want to share some of the documentation, you'll be much more likely to steward those people. So for most of you, the PIN or the event doesn't cost so much. And the risk of sort of ostracizing people who have put you in their will is way higher than that one or two people come to an event when they don't actually have you in their estate plans yet. So we know that some organizations get a little bit more strict about this, but our recommendation would be to be open here. All right, third recommendation here is really leaning into the moment. So many nonprofits are worried about appearing insensitive if they ask for planned gifts during the coronavirus, but it is also the time where those planned gift requests are the most powerful they've been in dozens of years. And this comes at the same time that they're seeing decreases in annual giving and bigger increases in planned giving. So when we asked nonprofits, compared to 2019, has your organization seen an increase or decrease in annual giving? 31% said annual giving has gone down, but the number of people who said planned giving has gone down is pretty small. At the same time, 34% of people said planned giving has increased, where only 27% of people said annual giving has increased. So this can be a big boon to your organization and keep the trains running on time for decades to come if you can lean into this moment. So the folks, what we're seeing here is that there's really two directions nonprofits are going in. One is the people that are shying away, and which is a fair reaction. It's too sensitive. We don't want to annoy anybody. We don't want to put anybody off. The other folks are leaning into it more. And the folks that are leaning into it more are seeing remarkable results. So if you can navigate this internally, you should see outsized returns for your efforts in a way that just wasn't true 12 months ago. We've also seen, by the way, that bequests on FreeWill have risen rapidly during the pandemic as more and more people make wills. We're also seeing more giving per will. So it's not just the number of wills are going up, the giving per will is going up. And it might be the case that people are just feeling a little bit more aware of the outside world now. And that it's difficult in 2020 to be totally self-centered on your family and yourself. And you know that obviously climate change matters, public health matters, advocacy matters, all these things that are really key to a functioning society and a functioning planet are just right in front of your face in a way they might not be in 2019 when you might be busy with other things. If you are doing this, it is actually very, very possible to be thoughtful and sensitive. Here's a little bit of the mechanics on how to do that. So one, you want to acknowledge the crisis. Not doing so is going to make you seem a little bit naive. You want to lead with candor and empathy. So in a lot of the previous sessions, we've talked about sharing your own working experience, whether it's at home with your kids and your puppies in the background or whatever it may be. You can share that and feel much more of a human connection than you might have thought about 2 years ago. You want to offer solutions and resources. People are generally a little bit panicked. And if you can point the path forward, people will follow that. Some example language here is you can even acknowledge the debate around sharing this resource. So one partner wrote, "I was hesitant to share a Legacy Society giving resource during this moment, but our organization wanted to provide a way for you to get peace of mind. And this had remarkably strong results." So you wouldn't normally speak without full confidence as a nonprofit, but actually some vulnerability here had really outsized results and is pretty impressive. Other language that people use, writing a will can help you plan for the future, protect what's most important to you, and get peace of mind. So again, this pitch on estate planning before planned giving has the benefits of offering people a path forward, starting with what's in it for them, as opposed to another donation ask. And then lastly, this sort of goes back to the vulnerability, but if you acknowledge vulnerability, people engage in something to a much deeper degree. So this organization wrote, "I know estate planning may seem odd or uncomfortable during this time, and in full transparency, we were on the fence about whether to send you this resource. But ultimately, we decided that sharing a free tool was a way of showing up for our community since it makes a necessary task accessible and easy." So again, this shift of saying, look, we weren't sure about this, but we did it anyway because we thought it would be useful to you, really brings people closer to the organization and engages at a deeply human level because everyone's navigating uncertainty. And so it's okay for you to feel a little bit uncertain as well. All right, so that is a bunch of the core core takeaways, some core tactics on what to do about it. Feel free to pop in some more questions. We have some good time there. I'm going to walk you through a few resources that we've put together for you, and then we'll move on to questions. So we do have a guide to end of year giving. I know we've talked about this. It will be done this week. Simone, our new colleague, Magdalena, some of our designers, we're all working hard on this as well. So what we'll do here is create some sample emails. Those are already done. We put together survey templates that you can use, some best practice tips. These are all totally free. And so just make a note to request it in the survey if you haven't already. If you've signed up previously, feel free to write yes or no. We'd still love you to fill out the survey as well. We also have the full report available for download. So again, totally free, just designed to be a resource for you. It's about 20 plus pages of insight and data. There's a lot of graphs, so you can sort of flip through without reading all the text if you like. But there's a lot of good content in there, and you may find some things that are particularly useful. For instance, one thing we didn't cover in this session, but giving by state is in there, and looking to see how different states are more or less represented in estate planning and in giving is really interesting. So as you think about allocating your resources, well, Louisiana is not a very high giving state compared to Oregon or California. On Thursday, we're doing a group demo of some of the planned and major giving tools that people are using to really sort of shape their future as the world changes so much. And that's at Thursday and 1. Just make a note in the survey as well, and we'll send you a calendar invite. And then this thing that we started talking about 2 weeks ago, but I know that many of you are here having lost your jobs. This is obviously a difficult time. It's personally sad for me when we send out calendar invites and we get some bounce backs that says, so-and-so is no longer part of this organization. So 2 things. One is there are a couple of jobs that are open here that we want to bring to your attention. So the PAN Foundation and Defenders of Wildlife are hiring. You can go to their websites, but we were able to share that for them. And if you do have any other jobs that you want us to share here and to help sort of find employment for folks that are recently laid off, feel free to email me, or in our follow-up email with the recording, we'll send a link where you can submit a new job. So just trying to look out for the community, and thank you to PAN and Defenders who shared this. And so if you're interested in employment there, go check those out at the website, and they're really excited about hiring. All right, so some next steps. 1, feel free to pop any final questions in the Q&A. Please fill out the survey, which Simone just pasted in the group chat. Our next webinar on 2 weeks from today is on how planned and major giving teams can make the most of Giving Tuesday. So we know that's coming up, and we've all got to scramble to get that ready. We also have a bunch of questions for you in the survey. So no matter what, please take it. And what we're doing is having folks vote on future topics, ranging from donor advised funds to the trends that are going to shape 2021 to things like career advancement. So please make a note there, and just, it's really, really helpful to understand what you're looking for. And if you have some ideas that aren't there, we'd love to hear from them. So please do that. And then if you have any other creative ideas to share as you're navigating this wild time, or if you need anything else and we can be helpful, just shoot me an email. So my email is there. And let's go to questions. Corinne asks, do women also make more bequests because they have longer life expectancy than male partners, and so they inherit partners well? Corinne, the answer is yes there. So if we're talking specifically about heterosexual marriages and those types of relationships, you have 2 factors at play. So most of us know that on average, women's life expectancy is longer than men's, including even more so if you take out risks around maternity. The other factor is that on average, women tend to marry men who are a couple years older than they are, and the inverse is true. Obviously, men marry women that are a little bit older, or a little bit younger, excuse me. So when you combine both life expectancy and the gap in marriage age, you actually have many more people who are single because their husband has passed away than single because their wife has passed away. So that's a big shift in the number of female bequests. David asks, what's the sample size you're using for all of this data? David, this is about 80,000 estate plans. So pretty robust and should be statistically significant in most of these ways. Do we think there's a correlation between tax time and the April increase in wills created? This was an anonymous question. There may be slight, but that giant jump isn't the case. And we know this because we looked at April from last year and previous years. And in fact, if you remember back to the spring when things were so wild, even more so than they were now, tax season actually got delayed a little bit. So a lot of people were able to file their taxes in July. So I think the dominant surge in April is what you would think of as sort of COVID panic and people really getting their affairs in order. So having a will and including charitable giving is a different thing. How many folks have a will but don't include charitable giving? So most people who make a will don't include charitable gifts. And the fact that it's still $40 billion a year is pretty remarkable. But actually 80 to 90% of people who make an estate plan don't include a bequest. And that's okay. People have plenty of other reasons why they're not able to do so. But given the size of the gifts, it's still worth pursuing. One thing we didn't include here is that there's an old IRS study that shows that a typical bequest is almost 3 times the entirety of someone's lifetime charitable giving. Meaning all the donations that I've given anywhere in my life, that a typical bequest is going to be 3 times larger than the sum total of all of that. Janet asks, is there a more user-friendly term for estate that would make it less scary to consider? So Janet, this is a great question. And generally we would pitch using as little jargon as possible. So what we would often say is, everybody needs a will, even if you plan on living to 150, or you could say everybody needs a will or trust. Or when we went back to the pet ownership, make sure that there's a plan for your pets if something happens to you. Make sure there's a plan for what happens if something happens to you. And this basic language around plan, as opposed to estate plan, can be much more accessible and powerful. Elizabeth asks, are there particular resources on will making that you would suggest to post on our website? So obviously FreeWill is a great resource there. Otherwise, you can do things like estate planning guides. It's also the case that there's a bunch of great articles out there on why to make an estate plan, and you can borrow some snippets from those and then link to the New York Times or Business Week or whoever wrote those. So that's accessible as well. And it's okay if somebody clicks off your website to go find that because it's such a powerful gift. So many people never want to link to news sites, which doesn't really make sense because if you have these very trusted sources, New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, et cetera, they will be very compelling for your donors as well. There was a question here, it's a little bit longer, so I'm going to paraphrase. We have a slight hesitancy around pursuing estate planning because of a single issue. If a donor to an organization were to pass away and leave a large bequest, then his or her heirs were to find out that our nonprofit had promoted estate planning or promoted free will, is there any issue? And I think the short answer is no. In most cases, what you'll find is that the much bigger risk to the family is that no one promotes estate planning, and then the family is left holding the bag with a mess. And so, yes, it is the case that occasionally you have heirs, just in estate planning generally, who are, want to go fight the charity about this. It's never a PR problem for the charity. It's usually a sort of PR problem for the kids who look a little bit greedy and not that great. But usually the case is that the families are really grateful that the parents were able to have an estate plan. So haven't seen this in 3 or 4 years of FreeWill, which involves 120,000 estate plans. So I think it's a very low risk. And if you think about what the upside is, which is millions of dollars to your organization, over-indexing on that risk feels like a strategic mistake. Sharon asked, do you have insight on how to navigate estate planning with a couple that has different goals on giving? Oh, this is a great question. I wish I had a better answer, but sort of marital counseling is above my pay grade. I think what you would want to understand is oftentimes the difference in views is because someone has a very clear vision and the other person isn't able to visualize that as well. So what I would do there is, instead of sort of going back and forth, I would say, let's put together 4 options, including one that has no giving. So option 1, no giving. Option 2, 12%, we think that could fund 14 scholarships or whatever, and go from there. And so you have very, very clear specifics that helps both couples sort of get out of their own heads for a little bit and just look at a menu of options. And when you include a 0 giving option, that gives you more credibility because you're not sort of a salesperson. You're saying, well, let me just help you understand what's possible, and then you make the decision, and that will be really powerful. And then the last question is, we provided some examples of messages that are working. Are we basing this on real results from emails that our partners send out, and how are we determining success? Yes, we are. So when we look at partners who are sending out outreach, we can then track the number of people that begin estate plans, that make gifts, how large those gifts are as well. So we're really fortunate just to have data and research that is not available to most of the plan giving world, because if you send a newsletter out in the mail, you might not know for 20 years how effective that was. So the idea that we can sort of in real time understand plan giving behavior is something we feel really lucky to do, and then try to use that as much as possible to inform the whole sector. So I think those are all the questions. We'll give it one more minute. While we do that, I'll just close out and say, our team is really thinking about you guys, especially on the West Coast. Also, those who are sending their kids back to school this week. And my sister's got 2 kids, and she and her husband work full time, and it's just chaos. They're sort of very highly functional. She works for the federal government. He's a reporter for the Washington Post. They're incredibly accomplished, competent people, and it's still chaos. So my heart goes out to everybody who's managing that right now. And then actually Rachel has one more question, then we'll wrap up. So she's curious if other organizations take part in National Estate Planning Awareness Week. We in public media do outreach, but we haven't seen it from outside our field. And the answer is definitely yes. So we just concluded August, which is National Make-A-Will Month. Now, it's not like your donors know that. Nobody has it on their calendar. Many of you guys didn't know that, and you're in estate planning or plan giving. But just giving a basic reason as to why do it right now can be really effective. So these weeks all sort of exist relatively arbitrarily, but can still be really powerful. So if anyone knows exactly what week that is, I think it might be the week of October 16th, but I could be wrong. Feel free to just pop that in the chat. And thank you again. Really, really wonderful to see everybody. And if you can join us in 2 weeks, we'll go through a Giving Tuesday. So take care and see you very soon.